The crowd in Iron Creek didn't come to see a man saved. They came to see a spirit broken. Standing on the auction block was Matthew Ryan, 6'4" of scarred muscle and mountain grit, chained to a post like a rabid dog. But the chains weren't what kept him quiet. It was the tiny, shivering bundle wrapped in a dirty woolen blanket tucked into the crook of his massive arm. A newborn baby. The town drunk laughed, shouting that no one wanted a killer for a nanny. The gavel was about to fall on a sentence of prison labor, separating the father from the child forever. That was until a voice cut through the rain, sharp, trembling and desperate. "I'll take him." It wasn't a rich rancher. It was a woman with a swollen belly, heavily pregnant, holding a shotgun in one hand and a bag of gold dust in the other. The mud in Iron Creek was thick enough to pull a boot right off a man's foot. But on this Tuesday in November, 1884, the town square was packed tight. The rain fell in cold grey sheets, turning the auction platform into a slick stage of misery. Jedediah Crouch, the town's auctioneer and unofficial mayor, wiped tobacco juice from his lip and slammed his gavel down on the podium. The sound cracked like a whip, silencing the murmurs of the miners and fur trappers gathered around. "All right, settle down, you vultures," Crouch bellowed, his voice rasping like sandpaper. "Next lot up ain't livestock, but he's built like an ox. State of Montana versus Matthew Ryan. Debt outstanding, $400 to the company store and medical fees." A ripple of unease went through the crowd. Everyone knew Matthew Ryan. He was a mountain man who lived up past the timberline on Black Ridge. He was a ghost story parents told their children, a man who supposedly wrestled grizzlies and spoke to no one. But today, the ghost looked human, broken. Matthew stood on the platform, his wrists bound in heavy iron shackles. His beard was a tangled mess of black and grey, and a fresh scar ran from his temple to his jaw, still angry and red. He wore buckskins that were stiff with old blood and grease. But the crowd wasn't staring at his size or his scars. They were staring at the bundle in his arms. Matthew held the baby high against his chest, shielding it from the freezing rain with his own body. He hunched over, making himself a human roof. The baby let out a thin, reedy cry, a sound so fragile it seemed to cut through the heavy atmosphere of the mining camp. "Look at that!" a miner named Dutch shouted from the front row, spitting on the ground. "Selling a man is one thing, Crouch, but selling a wet nurse, that's rich." Laughter erupted. Cruel, hard laughter. Matthew didn't flinch. His dark eyes were fixed on the mud below. He knew the law. He couldn't pay the doctor who had tried and failed to save his wife during the birth 3 weeks ago. In this lawless territory, debt was a crime, and the punishment was indentured servitude. If nobody bought his debt, he went to the chain gang at the quarry, and the baby went to the orphanage in Helena. Matthew tightened his grip on the bundle. He would die before he let them take the girl. "Do I hear $50 for the labor of Matthew Ryan?" Crouch shouted. "He's strong as an ox, can clear an acre of timber in a day, comes with extra baggage, strictly non-negotiable." Crouch poked a finger at the baby. Matthew let out a low growl, a sound so deep it vibrated the wooden planks. He snapped his head up, eyes blazing with a feral intensity. Crouch pulled his hand back as if he'd touched a hot stove. $50! Crouch stammered. "Who'll start me at 50? Silence. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A man with a baby was a liability. A mountain man with a baby was a joke. 20! Crouch tried again. $20 for a year of hard labor. "I don't want the brat squalling while I'm trying to work," a rancher yelled out. "Separate 'em, and I'll give you 10. Matthew looked up then, scanning the crowd. He was looking for mercy, but he found only amusement. Sheriff Colt Miller stood by the steps, hand on his gun, looking bored. This was the end. Matthew felt the despair clawing at his throat. He had failed her. He had failed his wife, Sarah, and now he was failing their daughter, Rose. "Going once," Crouch raised the gavel. "If there are no bids, the prisoner is remanded to the quarry, and the child is ward of the state. Going twice." Matthew closed his eyes. "I'm sorry, Sarah. 300... Wait." The voice didn't come from the front. It came from the back, near the livery stables where the shadows were deepest. The crowd parted, turning to look. A woman stepped forward. She was struggling through the mud, one hand clutching a woolen shawl tight around her throat, the other resting protectively on her stomach. She was heavily pregnant, 7, maybe 8 months along. Her red hair was plastered to her face by the rain, and her dress was patched and faded, but her chin was held high. It was Clara O'Malley. The town knew her, or at least they whispered about her. She lived alone on the old O'Malley place, the Broken Wheel, 10 miles out of town. Her husband had died in a mining accident 6 months ago, leaving her with a failing ranch and a child on the way. Most expected her to pack up and leave for back east. Instead, she had stayed, stubborn as a mule. "I bid," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly but gaining strength. "I bid $80. A hush fell over the square. $80 was a fortune. It was everything she had, maybe more than she had. Crouch squinted through the rain. "Mrs. O'Malley, you ain't got the coin, and you surely don't need a man like this." "I have the gold," Clara said, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a heavy leather pouch. She tossed it onto the platform. It landed with a heavy thud at Crouch's feet. "Weigh it. It's pure dust. $80. She looked up at Matthew. For a second, their eyes locked. He looked at her with confusion, bordering on suspicion. Why would a widow with nothing to her name buy a mountain man? "Clara, be reasonable." Sheriff Miller stepped in, tipping his hat. "This man is dangerous. He's lived wild. You're a woman alone out there. It ain't proper, and it ain't safe." Clara turned her gaze to the sheriff, her green eyes flashing. "What isn't safe, Sheriff, is a winter coming on with a barn roof that's caved in and no wood chopped. I need a hand. I don't need a husband, and I certainly don't need your advice." She turned back to Crouch. "I bought his debt. Sign the paper." Crouch weighed the bag in his hand, greed warring with confusion. The gold was good. He shrugged. Money was money. "Sold!" Crouch yelled, banging the gavel. "To the widow O'Malley. $80. He tossed a key to Clara. It landed in the mud. "Unchain your beast, lady. He's your problem now." Clara bent down as best she could with her swollen belly, her fingers trembling as she picked up the cold iron key. She walked up the steps, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She approached Matthew. Up close, he smelled of pine resin, old sweat, and wet dog. He was terrifying. Matthew didn't move. He watched her hands. If she tried to touch the baby, he would snap the chains, law be damned. But she didn't reach for the baby. She reached for his wrists. "Hold still," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. She slotted the key into the cuffs. Click, the heavy iron fell away. Matthew rubbed his wrists, the blood rushing back into his hands. He looked down at this small, fierce woman who had just bought his life. "Why?" he rasped. His voice was like grinding stones. He hadn't spoken in days. Clara stepped back, creating distance, her hand instinctively going to the pistol concealed in her pocket. "Get in the wagon," she said, her tone all business. "We're burning daylight, and I won't have that baby out in this rain a minute longer." The ride out of Iron Creek was agonizingly silent. Clara drove the buckboard wagon, snapping the reins over the backs of her 2 tired geldings, Buster and Blue. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, but the wind had picked up, cutting through the canyon like a knife. Matthew sat on the bench beside her, a looming presence that made the wagon feel tilted. He hadn't said a word since they left the auction block. He simply sat there, staring at the horizon, his massive hand constantly adjusting the blanket around the infant sleeping against his chest. Clara's mind was racing. What have I done? She stole a glance at him. He was huge. His hands were the size of shovels. If he wanted to, he could toss her off this wagon and take the horses. She had the Colt Navy revolver in her pocket. But could she use it? Against a man who wrestled bears? The road to the Broken Wheel Ranch was treacherous, a winding switchback trail that climbed 2,000 feet into the foothills. The mud sucked at the wagon wheels, making the horses strain and huff. "Whoa, easy now," Clara cooed to the horses, hiding her anxiety. The wagon hit a deep rut. The front left wheel jarred violently, and the whole vehicle listed to the side. Clara gasped, gripping the railing to keep from sliding off. The jolt woke the baby. A high-pitched wail erupted from the bundle in Matthew's arms. Matthew stiffened immediately. He looked down, panic flashing across his scarred face. He rocked back and forth, awkwardly patting the bundle with a hand that looked like it could crush a stone. "Shh, shh, Rose. Easy, little bit," he mumbled. His voice was surprisingly soft, stripped of the growl he'd used in town. The baby wouldn't settle. The wails grew louder, turning into frantic screams of hunger. Clara watched him struggle. She saw the desperation in his eyes. He checked a small pouch at his waist, pulling out a rag soaked in something. Sugar water, maybe? He tried to offer it to the baby, but the child turned her head away, screaming. "She's hungry," Clara said, keeping her eyes on the road. "I know," Matthew snapped, defensive. "I ain't got milk. The goat died 2 days ago. Been giving her sugar water." Clara's heart clenched. A newborn on sugar water for 2 days. That explained why the baby sounded so weak. "There's a tin of goat's milk in the back, under the tarp," Clara said, "and a clean rag. Soaking it in water won't do. You need to mix it thick." Matthew looked at her, then back at the screaming child. He didn't move. He didn't trust her. To him, she was a jailer who just happened to be a woman. "Mr. Ryan," Clara said, her voice sharpening, "I might have bought your debt, but I didn't buy your pride. That baby is starving. Get the milk." Matthew gritted his teeth. He shifted the baby to one arm, reached back with his long reach, and rummaged under the tarp. He found the tin and a spoon. He worked with surprising dexterity, mixing a paste in a tin cup with rainwater, dipping the rag in, and bringing it to the baby's mouth. Rose latched onto the rag instantly. The screaming stopped, replaced by frantic, suckling noises. Matthew let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an hour. His shoulders slumped. "Rose," Clara said softly. "Is that her name?" Matthew nodded once, not looking at her. "Rose, after her mother." "Where is her mother?" Clara asked, though she suspected the answer. "Buried," Matthew said. The word was final. It slammed the door on the conversation. They rode in silence for another hour. As they climbed higher one, the air grew thinner and colder. The landscape changed from muddy mining slop to pristine, dangerous wilderness. Pine trees towered over them. Finally, the Broken Wheel Ranch came into view. It was a desolate sight. The main house was a sturdy log cabin, but the porch was sagging. The barn roof had indeed partially collapsed under the weight of an early snow the previous month. Fences were broken, weeds choked the garden. It was a place that was slowly dying, much like the woman trying to save it. Matthew looked at the property, his eyes narrowing. He was a man who knew the land. He saw the rot in the wood, the lean of the chimney. "You live here alone?" he asked. It was the first time he had initiated conversation. "I do," Clara said, pulling on the reins to stop the wagon in the yard. "Husband?" "Dead. Mine collapse." Matthew looked at her stomach. "And you bought a man to work this place, in your condition?" "I bought a man to save this place," Clara corrected him, climbing down. She landed heavily, wincing as a sharp pain shot through her lower back. She grabbed the wheel for support, breathing through hissing teeth. Matthew watched her. He carefully placed the sleeping Rose into a padded crate he had wedged between his feet, then stepped down from the wagon. He didn't walk around to help her. He stood by the horses, unhitching them with practiced ease. "I ain't a farmer," Matthew grunted, tossing the harness over the fence. "I hunt, I trap, I don't plow." "There's no plowing to be done in November, Mr. Ryan," Clara said, straightening up and wrapping her shawl tighter. "I need wood chopped. I need the roof fixed before the first blizzard hits. I need the fences mended so the coyotes don't take the chickens. And—" She hesitated. Matthew paused, looking at her over the back of the horse. "And what?" Clara looked toward the dark tree line surrounding the ranch. Her face paled slightly. "And I need someone to watch the road at night." Matthew went still. He saw the fear in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of the elements. It was the fear of a hunted animal. "Who's coming?" Matthew asked, low and dangerous. "Hopefully no one," Clara said quickly, turning towards the house. "There's a cot in the tack room in the barn. It's dry. You can sleep there. I'll bring blankets for the baby." "The baby stays with me," Matthew said. "I didn't say she wouldn't. But you can't keep a newborn in a barn in November, Matthew." Clara used his first name for the first time. "Bring her inside. She can sleep by the hearth. You sleep in the barn. That's the deal." Matthew stared at her. He weighed his options. He could take the horses and run. But where? With a newborn? He had no supplies, no milk. This woman had food. She had a roof. Fine, Matthew spat. He scooped up Rose, who was sleeping soundly now. He followed Clara towards the house. As he walked up the porch steps, the wood groaned under his weight. He noticed something etched into the doorframe, a symbol carved with a knife. It was small, barely visible, a circle with a line through it. Matthew stopped. He knew that mark. He'd seen it in the darker corners of the territory, used by the cattle thieves and cutthroats who worked for Thaddeus Rourke, the land baron who owned half the valley. It was a mark that meant claimed. Clara opened the door, unaware that Matthew had frozen. "Coming?" she asked. Matthew looked at the woman, then at the baby in his arms, and finally back at the dark woods. He realized then that he hadn't just been bought to fix a roof. He had been bought for a war. "Yeah," Matthew said, stepping across the threshold. "I'm coming." The interior of the cabin was a testament to a losing battle. As Matthew stepped through the door, ducking his head to avoid the lintel, the warmth of the hearth washed over him, but it couldn't hide the poverty etched into the walls. The chinking between the logs had crumbled away in places, stuffed hastily with old newspapers and rags to keep the biting wind at bay. The furniture was sparse, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a rocking chair near the fire that looked like it had been mended a dozen times. Matthew felt too large for the room. He was a creature of open skies and timberlines. Enclosed spaces made his skin crawl. He stood awkwardly by the door, Rose still tucked in the crook of his arm, looking like a bear trapped in a pantry. "Put her in the cradle," Clara said, gesturing to a small wooden box lined with sheepskin near the fire. She had collapsed into one of the kitchen chairs, her face grey with exhaustion. It was meant for my baby. But Rose needs it now." Matthew moved slowly. He knelt by the cradle, his movement surprisingly gentle. He lowered Rose into the soft wool. The baby fussed for a moment, her tiny fists grasping at the air, before the warmth of the fire lulled her back into a rhythmic slumber. Matthew lingered there for a moment, his scarred hand hovering over her chest, checking for the rise and fall of her breath. It was a habit born of 3 weeks of terror, the constant fear that she would simply stop breathing, just like her mother. "She's small," Clara observed softly. She hadn't taken off her coat yet. The chill of the ride was still in her bones. "She's strong," Matthew corrected, his voice low. He stood up, the floorboards groaning. "Where's the wood?" "Out back. But there isn't much split. I couldn't swing the axe these past few weeks." Matthew nodded. He didn't offer pity. Pity didn't keep a fire burning. He turned and walked out the back door. Through the single grime-streaked window, Clara watched him. He moved with a terrifying efficiency. She saw the flash of the axe blade in the twilight, heard the crack of pine splitting, rhythmically, tirelessly. In 10 minutes he returned with an armful of wood that would have taken her 2 days to gather. He stoked the fire, building it up until the shadows retreated to the corners of the room. "I'm making stew," Clara said, pushing herself up from the chair. She moved to the stove, her hand instinctively going to her lower back. "Sit," Matthew rumbled. He didn't look at her. He was busy drying his wet buckskins by the heat. "I can cook. If you fall, I ain't carrying you." Clara bristled. "I'm pregnant, Mr. Ryan, not an invalid. I hired you for the heavy lifting, not to be my nursemaid." Matthew turned his head, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You hired me to keep this place running. If the mistress of the house dies of stubbornness, I'm back in chains. Sit down." It wasn't a request. Clara sat. Matthew took over the kitchen. He moved around the small space, finding the sack of potatoes, the shriveled onions, and the small strip of dried beef. He worked in silence, peeling potatoes with a hunting knife that looked sharp enough to shave with. An hour later, they sat across from each other at the small table. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose window panes, but inside, the smell of savory broth filled the air. Matthew placed a bowl in front of her. It was full to the brim. He took his own bowl, half the size of hers, and sat down. Clara looked at the disparity. "You're a big man. You need more than that. I ate yesterday," Matthew lied. He hadn't eaten a full meal in 4 days. "Eat for the baby." They ate in a heavy silence. The only sounds were the scraping of spoons and the crackle of the fire. Clara watched him covertly. He ate with a disciplined hunger, savouring every bite. Yet he paused every time Rose made a sound in her sleep, his fork freezing halfway to his mouth until she settled. "Why did you do it?" Matthew asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. He didn't look up from his bowl. $80. You could have hired 3 farmhands for the season with that dust. Or bought a ticket to St. Louis. Clara set her spoon down. Her hand trembled slightly. The farmhands in Iron Creek work for Thaddeus Rourke. Or they're too scared of him to work for me. And St. Louis? I have nothing in St. Louis but a family that disowned me for marrying an Irishman. Matthew looked up at the mention of Rourke. The name carried weight in the territory. Rourke was a land baron who solved disputes with fire and lead. "So you bought a monster to fight a monster," Matthew said flatly. "I bought a father," Clara replied, holding his gaze. "I saw how you held her. A man who fights that hard for a child. That's a man who understands what's at stake." She gestured around the room. "This land is all I have for my child. Rourke wants it. He's been squeezing me out, poisoning the well, cutting the fences. He's waiting for winter to finish what he's started." Matthew absorbed this. He looked at the door, remembering the carved mark. Claimed. "He's marked your door," Matthew said. Clara went pale. "What?" "The frame. A circle with a line. Cattle thieves use it. Means the house is marked for burning or taking. They've been here while you were in town." Clara's breath hitched. She instinctively covered her stomach. "When?" "Recently. The cut is fresh." Matthew scraped the last of his stew. He stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the table. "You got a rifle?" "A Winchester. Above the mantel. But I'm low on rounds." Matthew walked to the mantel and took down the rifle. He checked the action, inspecting the mechanism with the critical eye of a gunsmith. He snapped it shut. "Go to sleep, Mrs. O'Malley," Matthew said. He walked to the rocking chair, dragging it so it faced the front door. He sat down, the rifle across his lap, his body positioned between the entrance and the woman and children. "You're not sleeping in the barn?" Clara asked, her voice small. Matthew looked at Rose, sleeping peacefully in the cradle, then at the terrified woman. "Not tonight," he said, staring at the door. "Tonight, the wolf stays inside." The morning sun broke over the peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, casting a pale, cold light onto the Broken Wheel Ranch. The storm had passed, leaving the world crisp and frozen. Clara woke to the sound of hammering. She sat up with a start, disoriented. She was in her bed in the back room, covered in a heavy quilt she didn't remember pulling up. She hurried into the main room. The rocking chair was empty, the rifle gone. The cradle was empty too. Panic flared in her chest, a cold, sharp spike. He took her. He took the horses and left. She threw open the front door, stumbling out onto the porch in her nightdress and boots, the cold air biting at her skin. "Matthew!" she screamed. "Up here!" The voice came from above. Clara looked up. Matthew was straddling the peak of the barn roof, 30 feet in the air. He had a mouthful of nails and a hammer in his hand. Down below, in the sunlight of the corral, the cradle was set safely on a bale of hay. Rose was awake, kicking her legs, watching a goat that Matthew must have found and tethered nearby. Clara slumped against the porch railing, the relief making her knees weak. "I thought—" Matthew slid down the roof with the grace of a cat, landing on the hayloft platform and taking the ladder down. He walked over to her, wiping sweat from his brow despite the freezing temperature. He had removed his buckskin jacket. Beneath it, he wore a grey union suit that clung to his powerful frame. "Thought I ran?" Matthew asked. His tone wasn't accusatory, just factual. "I don't run from a debt, Mrs. O'Malley. And I don't leave a roof leaking." He pointed to the barn, patched the main hole, shored up the support beam. "It'll hold snow now. Found a nanny goat wandering the ridge. She's got milk. Rose ate an hour ago." Clara stared at him. In one morning, he had done more work than she had managed in 3 months. He wasn't just working, he was fortifying. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Matthew said, his eyes shifting to the road leading up to the ranch. "Company's coming." Clara followed his gaze. Far down the canyon road, 3 riders were approaching. They were moving at a trot, not hurrying, just inevitable. Matthew walked over to the bale of hay and picked up his gun belt, strapping it on. He didn't pick up Rose. He moved the cradle behind the water trough, shielding it from the line of sight of the road. "Go inside," Matthew said. "This is my land," Clara said, her chin lifting. "I won't hide in my own house." "Then stand behind me," Matthew commanded, "and don't draw that pistol unless I'm down." The riders entered the yard. The lead man was Harlan Griggs, Thaddeus Rourke's foreman. Griggs was a man who enjoyed his work too much. He wore a long duster and a hat pulled low over eyes that were as flat and black as a shark's. The two men behind him were hired guns, rough, dirty, and smiling with bad intentions. Griggs pulled his horse up, the animal snorting steam. He looked at Clara, then his eyes slid to Matthew. He didn't look impressed, just annoyed. "Morning, widow," Griggs drawled. "So you got yourself a stray." "Mr. Griggs," Clara said, her voice steady, though her hands were gripping her skirt. "You're trespassing. Again." "Just being neighbourly," Griggs smiled, revealing yellow teeth. "Mr. Rourke heard you made a foolish purchase in town yesterday. Spending your travel money on a convict?" "He's worried about your judgment, Clara. He sent me to make the offer one last time. $500 for the deed. Take the stagecoach east before the snow locks you in." "The answer is no," Clara said. Griggs sighed theatrically. He looked at Matthew. "And you. Big man. You look like you got some miles on you. You really want to die for a patch of dirt that don't belong to you?" Matthew stepped forward. He didn't reach for his gun. He just walked until he was standing by the head of Griggs's horse. The animal shied away from him, sensing a predator. "Turn around," Matthew said. His voice was like grinding gravel. Griggs laughed. "Or what? You're one man, mountain trash. I got two boys here itching for practice." "Look at the barn," Matthew said. Griggs frowned and looked up at the barn roof. "I fixed the beam," Matthew continued calmly. "And while I was up there, I saw your spotter up on the ridge. The one with the Sharp's rifle. If your boys draw, I'll pull you off this horse and snap your neck before they clear leather. Then I'll take your Winchester and kill the man on the ridge." The silence that followed was heavy. Griggs's smile vanished. He hadn't expected the big man to be observant. He hadn't expected tactical awareness. He had expected a brute. Matthew placed a hand on Griggs' horse's bridle. "This woman bought my debt. That means her problems are my problems. And right now you're my biggest problem." Griggs stared at Matthew, measuring him. He saw the scar. He saw the eyes that had seen death and dealt it out in equal measure. This wasn't a farmhand. This was a killer on a leash. Griggs yanked the reins, pulling the horse back. "Have it your way, friend. But winter is long, and accidents happen." He turned his horse, spitting on the ground near Matthew's boots. "Let's go, boys." The three riders wheeled around and galloped out of the yard. Clara let out a shaky breath, her adrenaline crashing. Was there really a man on the ridge? Matthew watched the dust settle. "No." He turned to her, his face grim. "But there will be tomorrow." They were scouting, testing the defenses. He walked over to the trough and picked up the cradle. Rose was awake, blinking up at the blue sky. Matthew looked down at his daughter, his expression softening for a fraction of a second before hardening again. "He wants the water," Matthew said, looking at the creek that ran behind the house. "I saw the survey stakes in the woods. This creek feeds the whole lower valley. If he controls this, he controls the mining sluices and the cattle herds." "I knew it was the water," Clara said bitterly. "But I can't fight an army, Matthew." "No," Matthew said. He walked toward the porch, carrying the baby. He stopped at the door and looked back at her. "You can't. But we aren't fighting an army. We're fighting men. And men bleed." He looked at the marked doorframe. He pulled his knife and, with a savage slice, gouged the mark out of the wood, sending splinters flying. "I need nails," Matthew said, "and black powder. If you have any blasting caps left from your husband's mining gear, get them." "What are you going to do?" Clara asked, fear mixing with awe. Matthew turned, the ghost of a dark smile touching his lips. "I'm going to make sure that the next time they come up that road, they wish they'd stayed in hell." The snow began to fall 3 days later. It didn't start as a storm, but as a silent, suffocating blanket that turned the world white and muffled the sounds of the valley. Inside the broken wheel cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from one of terrified survival to a grim, rhythmic preparation for war. The table, once used for dining, was now covered in dangerous clutter. Canisters of black powder, lengths of fuse, rusted nails, and empty tin cans. Clara sat in the rocking chair, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She watched Matthew work. He was seated at the table, the lantern light casting deep hollows in his face. He moved with the precision of a watchmaker, pouring exact measurements of gunpowder into a small burlap sack, mixing it with iron filings and nails, then sealing it tight with tallow and twine. "You've done this before," Clara said softly. It wasn't a question. Matthew didn't look up. His large fingers tied a knot with surprising delicacy. "The army. 62 to 65. I was a sapper. My job was to blow up bridges so the Rebs couldn't follow." Clara stared at him. The town drunk had called him a beast. The sheriff called him a drifter. But the man sitting at her table was an engineer of destruction. "That feels like a lifetime ago," Matthew murmured, setting the finished explosive aside. "Before the mountains. Before Sarah." He said her name without the usual sharp edge of pain. Clara seized the moment. "Tell me about her. Please. If we're going to die here, I want to know who I'm fighting beside." Matthew stopped working. He leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking. He looked over at the cradle where Rose was sleeping. The baby had filled out in the last few days. The goat's milk agreed with her. "She was a missionary's daughter," Matthew said, his voice raspy. "Found me half frozen in a drift 5 years back. Thawed me out. She didn't care about the scars or the war. She just saw a man." He rubbed his face with a calloused hand. "We built a cabin up near the timberline. We were happy. Just us and the sky. When she got with child, I told her we should come down to town, to be near a doctor. She said no, said the town was full of sickness and sin." He looked at his hands. "She was right about the sin, but I was wrong about the doctor. By the time I carried her down the mountain, it was too late. Bleeding wouldn't stop." Clara felt a tear trace a cold path down her cheek. She understood that pain, the helpless, crushing weight of losing the person who anchored you to the earth. "My Sean," Clara began, her voice trembling. "He didn't die in a collapse. Not right away. The timber pinned him. He was there for 2 days before they dug him out. He was still singing when they found him, singing to keep the dark away." She looked at Matthew. "He bought this land because he said the soil tasted like hope. I can't let Rourke take that. I can't let Sean's hope become just another one of Rourke's cattle pastures." Matthew looked at her. For the first time, the wall between them completely crumbled. There were 2 shipwrecks on the same shore, guarding the only treasure they had left, the future. "He won't take it," Matthew promised. "I'm rigging the perimeter. If they come on horses, the noise poppers will spook the animals. If they come on foot—" He tapped the nail-filled sack. "They'll lose their appetite for the fight." Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the room. Not from the baby. Clara gasped, doubling over in the chair, clutching her stomach. Her face went white as a sheet. Matthew was out of his chair in a heartbeat. He was at her side, kneeling. "Clara, is it the baby?" Clara gritted her teeth, breathing in short, sharp hisses. "Falls. Labor. Braxton Hicks, I think. It's been happening since yesterday. Stress. You need rest," Matthew said, his voice urgent. "You can't be sitting up watching me build bombs." "I can't sleep," she whispered. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Griggs. I see the fire." Matthew stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the falling snow. It was coming down harder now. The pass would be closed by morning. They were trapped. "I'm going out to set the charges," Matthew said. "Once they're set, nothing gets within 50 yards of this house without me knowing. You can sleep. I'll take the first watch." He put on his heavy coat and grabbed the sack of explosives. At the door, he paused. "Clara." She looked up, sweat beading on her forehead. "If I don't come back in through this door," he said seriously, "you take the baby. You take the colt in the barn. You ride straight up the creek bed. Don't look back." "You're coming back," Clara said fiercely. Matthew didn't answer. He slipped out into the cold, dark night, leaving Clara alone with the ghosts and the sleeping child. The wind picked up at midnight, a howling gale that rattled the shingles and made the chimney moan. To anyone listening, it sounded like the mountains were screaming. Matthew lay prone on the roof of the porch, wrapped in a buffalo hide. The snow was piling up on his back, but he didn't move. He was a statue of patience. His Winchester rested on a sandbag he'd dragged up, the barrel covered with a cloth to keep the snow out of the action. His eyes scanned the tree line. The darkness was absolute, but Matthew Ryan didn't look for shapes. He looked for movement. He looked for the absence of the natural. 2 hours passed. The cold seeped into his bones, waking the ache in his old war wounds. Then he saw it. A flicker. Not a lantern, but the spark of a match striking against a boot sole. It was 300 yards out, near the split rail fence. Amateurs, Matthew thought, lighting a pipe on a stealth raid. He didn't fire. He waited. Shadows detached themselves from the tree line. 1, 2, 5 of them. They moved low, hunching against the wind. They weren't riding. The snow was too deep for horses to charge. They were on foot. Matthew watched them approach the first perimeter marker he had set, a pile of stones near the garden gate. 3 more steps, Matthew thought. Come on. The lead man, a tall figure carrying a torch that wasn't yet lit, stepped on the tripwire. It wasn't a lethal trap. Matthew knew that killing Rourke's men outright would bring the US. Marshals down on them. This was psychological warfare. The wire pulled a pin on a spring-loaded arm Matthew had cannibalized from a bear trap. The arm snapped forward, striking a percussion cap set into a buried tin of black powder and sawdust. Boom! The explosion wasn't massive, but in the silence of the snow-muffled valley, it sounded like a cannon shot. A geyser of dirt and snow erupted 10 feet in front of the men. The attackers scattered, shouting in confusion. "It's rigged! The whole damn yard is rigged!" one voice screamed. Matthew sighted down the barrel of the Winchester. He aimed not at the men, but at the unlit torch the leader had dropped in the snow. He squeezed the triggers. The shot cracked through the wind. The bullet struck the kerosene-soaked rags of the torch. It didn't light, but the impact sent it skittering across the frozen ground. "Go home!" Matthew bellowed from the roof. His voice carried terrifying authority. "Next one takes a leg." "Flush him out!" a voice commanded from the darkness. It was Griggs. "Burn the house. The widow won't fight if the roof is burning." The men rallied. 2 of them rushed forward, flanking the house. They had Molotov cocktails, whiskey bottles stuffed with rags. Matthew worked the lever of his rifle. Clack, clack. He shot the bottle in the hand of the man on the left. Glass shattered, and the man screamed as the fuel soaked his glove, though it didn't ignite. He dropped to the snow, clutching his hand. But the man on the right was faster. He lit his bottle and hurled it. The bottle arced through the air, glowing like an angry meteor. It smashed against the side of the cabin, right below the window where the baby slept. Flames roared to life, licking up the dry logs. "No!" Matthew roared. He abandoned his sniper nest. He slid down the porch roof, dropping 12 feet into the snow. He rolled and came up running. Gunfire erupted from the tree line. Bullets kicked up snow around his feet. Matthew ignored them. He sprinted towards the water trough. He grabbed a metal bucket, broke the thin layer of ice with his fist, and scooped up freezing water. He ran into the hail of bullets, reaching the side of the house. He threw the water onto the flames. It hissed, steam billowing up, but the fire was catching on the old, dry wood. He needed more water. A bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing through the buckskin and biting into flesh. Matthew grunted, stumbling. He fell against the burning wall. "Matthew!" The front door flew open. Clara stood there. She wasn't hiding. She held a heavy woolen blanket in her hands. She ran out into the snow, barefoot. "Get back inside!" Matthew screamed, grabbing her arm. "Smother it!" she yelled, throwing the blanket over the flames. She beat at the fire with her bare hands, fueled by the adrenaline of a mother protecting her young. Matthew dropped his rifle and joined her, packing snow against the logs, slamming the wet blanket against the wood. Together, they fought the fire while bullets whizzed past them, embedding themselves in the porch posts. The fire died, choking out into black smoke. Matthew grabbed Clara and threw her to the ground, covering her body with his own as a volley of shots chewed up the wall where they had just been standing. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his face inches from hers. "No," she gasped. "You?" "Just a scratch." Silence fell over the yard. The attackers had stopped firing. "Why did they stop?" Clara whispered, trembling in the snow. Matthew listened. He heard a sound that chilled him more than the wind. It was a rhythmic, heavy thumping sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from the road, a heavy wagon. "They didn't stop because they gave up," Matthew said, looking at the darkness. "They stopped because they were waiting for the heavy artillery." Out of the gloom, a massive shape emerged. It was a reinforced ore wagon, plated in sheet metal. Men were walking behind it, using it as a shield, and mounted on the front of the wagon, protruding through a slot in the metal, was the barrel of a Gatling gun. Rourke hadn't just sent cowboys. He had borrowed a weapon from the mining wars. Matthew looked at Clara, then at his rifle lying in the snow. He looked at the house where the baby lay. "Get inside," Matthew said, his voice eerily calm. "Take Rose. Go to the cellar." "What are you going to do?" Matthew reached into his boot and pulled out his hunting knife. He looked at the armored wagon rumbling closer, the Gatling gun's barrels beginning to spin. "I'm going to finish the war," he said, "or I'm going to end the debt." The night exploded. The Gatling gun roared, a mechanical demon spitting fire. Bullets shredded the front wall of the cabin, turning the sturdy logs into splinters. Inside, Clara screamed, not from fear, but from a pain that tore through her body. The shock had turned false labor into the real thing. "Stay low!" Matthew yelled, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. He looked at the armored wagon inching closer. He couldn't shoot through the plating. He had one chance. He grabbed the remaining sack of black powder, the one he had packed with the heaviest iron nails. "Matthew!" Clara gasped, clutching the table leg. "It's coming!" "Hold on, Clara, just hold on!" Matthew didn't run away from the gun. He ran toward the darkness of the tree line, flanking wide. The gunner, blinded by the muzzle flash and the smoke, didn't see the shadow detach itself from the burning house. Matthew circled around, his lungs burning, the wound in his shoulder screaming. He came up behind the wagon. Griggs was shouting orders, safe behind the metal shield. Matthew lit the fuse. He waited 2 agonizing seconds, watching the spark hiss, then rolled the heavy sack under the wagon, right beneath the ammunition crate. "Payment delivered!" Matthew roared. He dove behind a fallen oak tree just as the world turned white. The explosion was deafening. The blast lifted the heavy ore wagon 3 feet into the air. The axle snapped, the wheel shattered, and the ammunition crate on board cooked off in a secondary explosion that sent Griggs and his men scrambling into the snow, deafened and terrified. The gun fell silent. The attackers, broken and bleeding, fled into the night, dragging their wounded. Matthew didn't chase them. He scrambled up, stumbling through the smoke back to the ruin of the cabin. "Clara!" He found her on the floor, surrounded by debris. She was pale, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "The baby," she whispered. "It's stuck. Matthew, help me." Matthew froze. The memory of Sarah, the blood, the failure, crashed into him. His hands shook. He was a killer, a breaker of stones. He wasn't a healer. "I can't," he choked out. "I can't do it again." Clara reached up and grabbed his blood-stained shirt. Her grip was iron. "You are not that man anymore. You are here. Look at me. Save us, Matthew." Her eyes anchored him. He took a breath, shoving the ghosts aside. He washed his hands in the bucket of melted snow. He knelt. He guided. He became the calm in the center of the storm. "Push, Clara, now!" A final cry, a rush of movement, and then a new sound. A strong, lusty wail that rose above the whistling wind. Matthew held the slippery, squalling infant in his massive hands. A boy. He wrapped the child in his own coat and laid him on Clara's chest. The sun was just beginning to crest over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. The house was half destroyed, the yard was a crater, but inside, life had won. 6 months later, Sheriff Miller rode up to the broken wheel. The fence was mended. A new barn roof gleamed in the spring sun. He found Matthew on the porch, rocking Rose in one arm, and the baby boy, named Sean, in the other. Clara was in the garden, planting corn. "Came to check the papers," the sheriff said, eyeing Matthew respectfully. "Says here your debt is paid in full. You're a free man, Ryan. You moving on?" Matthew looked at the mountains, then at Clara, who had stopped her work to watch him. He looked at the children in his arms. "No, Sheriff," Matthew said. A rare, genuine smile breaking through his scars. "I reckon I've got too much invested here to leave now." And that is the legend of the debt of Iron Creek. Matthew Ryan was auctioned off as a broken man, valued at $80 of dust. But in the end, his worth couldn't be measured in gold. He found redemption not by escaping his past, but by facing it head-on to protect a future that wasn't even his own. It's a reminder that sometimes the family we choose is stronger than the blood we're born with, and that even the most shattered souls can find a way to mend when they have something worth fighting for. "What do you think?" Would you have taken the risk Clara did? Or would you have ridden away when the Gatling gun showed up? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It helps get these stories out to more people. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a tale from the frontier. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next ride.